In the darkest corners of every unsolved crime, there is a whisper, something subtle, something almost invisible, yet powerful enough to expose the mind behind the madness. The hook of the story begins with this chilling truth. Serial killers rarely strike without leaving behind a fragment of themselves, a pattern etched into the crime scene like a shadow that refuses to fade. Imagine investigators standing over a silent room, everything still except the cold hum of fluorescent lights. They see the physical evidence, but there is something deeper, a deliberate choice, a strange arrangement, a symbol no one else notices at first. It is not coincidence. It is not accident. It is the killer speaking without using words. This is the heart of every signature, and once you understand the message, the entire world of the predator begins to unfold. It is in this moment that fear takes a new form, because the killer isn't just attacking bodies. They are expressing something far darker, a need to be seen, remembered, or obeyed. And that is when the investigation shifts from the physical world to the psychological battlefield, where patterns become weapons and clues become confessions. The introduction expands this tension as we dive into the mysterious idea of a serial killer. As signature, a unique emotional fingerprint left behind not to kill, but to communicate. Unlike an MO, which is simply how a killer operates, a signature is who they are. It is the ritual they cannot escape, the compulsion they cannot silence, and the emotional satisfaction they seek every time they strike. Some leave symbolic marks. Others position objects with careful intention. Some recreate a memory from childhood, while others leave behind cryptic messages designed to taunt investigators or feed their own ego. But no matter how different the details are, the purpose is the same. The signature is the killer's truth. It reveals their fantasies, motivations, fears, desires, and psychological wounds. It evolves as they evolve, grows bolder as they do, and becomes the one thing they cannot hide. For investigators, recognizing this pattern is like turning on a light in a room that has been dark for too long. Suddenly, the crimes are no longer isolated events. They are chapters of a single twisted story. And once the signature becomes clear, the chase becomes a battle of minds, where understanding the killer's inner world is the only path to stopping them. This video begins with that very journey, stepping into the labyrinth of deadly patterns, where every detail matters and every signature is a message waiting to be decoded. Every signature begins long before the first crime is ever committed. It grows silently in the mind of the future killer, taking shape through fantasies, fears, traumas, and unresolved obsessions. To understand a signature, investigators must look beyond the crime scene and step into the killer's private inner world, where imagination slowly becomes ritual. For many serial predators, the earliest seeds of their signature form in childhood moments when they first experience control, dominance, or emotional release through dark behavior. It could be an early fascination with a symbol, a repeated drawing, a ritualistic habit, or a scenario they replay in their mind again and again. Over time, these fantasies become more structured, more vivid, and eventually more demanding. The killer begins rehearsing them mentally, shaping them like an artist shaping clay. By the time they commit their first murder, the fantasy has matured into a personal ritual that demands to be acted out. Often, the first crime is clumsy, chaotic, and impulsive. But hidden within that chaos are small, deliberate choices, the first hints of a signature, a specific object left behind, a posture, a repeated gesture only the killer understands. Investigators later learn that while the killer's skills improve, the emotional purpose behind the act stays the same. What began as silent imagination becomes an irresistible compulsion. The signature evolves, not because the killer wants to change it, but because they want to express it more perfectly. And as the crimes continue, the signature becomes the only stable part of their twisted identity. A dark language formed long before the world ever knew their name. To decode a serial killer, Investigators must differentiate between two powerful concepts: the method of operation, known as the MO, and the signature. Though they appear similar, they come from entirely different motivations. The MO is practical. It describes how the killer gets the job done, the tools they use, how they approach victims, how they escape. An MO evolves as the killer gains experience or adapts to avoid capture. It's simply their technique, and like any technique, it improves or changes over time. The signature, however, is emotional. It is not necessary to commit the murder. It does not help the killer escape or conceal evidence. Instead, it satisfies a deep psychological need. It might be a specific gesture, a symbolic object, a ritualistic pattern, or a disturbing act that expresses something personal. This part never changes, not unless the killer themselves undergoes a major internal shift. Investigators often stumble at first, believing that similarities in MO automatically link crimes. But seasoned profilers know that looking for a signature is far more reliable. An MO can be faked or adjusted, but a signature cannot be hidden without emotional consequences. Some killers become sloppy because they are so focused on completing their ritual. Others escalate their signature, making it louder and more elaborate. That is when investigators begin to see the killer's psychological handwriting consistent, deliberate, and unmistakably unique. Understanding the difference between these two factors allows investigators to connect crimes across states, years, and circumstances. What appears random suddenly becomes predictable. The signature becomes a roadmap into the killer's psyche, revealing motivations that even the killer may not fully understand. And once that emotional pattern is identified, the hunt transforms from chasing evidence to chasing a mind. A serial killer's signature is more than a ritual, it's a compulsion. Investigators often describe it as the emotional engine behind each crime, the force that keeps the killer returning to their dark fantasies. To understand why a signature forms, one must look at the psychological hunger it feeds. These killers are driven not by the practical need to kill, but by the emotional payoff they receive from performing a specific act. For some, the ritual represents control finally dominating a world that once made them feel powerless. For others, it is a reenactment of trauma, an attempt to relive a moment they could never process. Some killers draw from deep-rooted fantasies shaped by isolation, humiliation, or fear. Their signature becomes the one place where they feel powerful, fulfilled, alive. This internal pressure grows until they can no longer resist acting it out. But compulsion is never static. With every crime, the emotional intensity shifts. The killer often experiences a short-lived sense of satisfaction, followed by a crash in emptiness that demands repetition. The signature is their attempt to perfect the feeling they chase. The perfection never comes. Instead, the ritual intensifies, evolves, and becomes more elaborate as the killer desperately tries to recreate an emotional high that slips through their fingers with each crime. Investigators recognize this psychological cycle: fantasy, preparation, ritual, act, release, regret, or emptiness, and then the return of the urge. The signature is the most revealing part of that cycle. Understanding it allows profilers to identify personality traits, emotional wounds, and behavioral patterns, making the killer's inner world clearer than ever. In the end, the signature becomes the killer's confession, silent, yet brutally honest, reflecting the darkest corners of a mind ruled by compulsion. When a killer acts out their fantasy for the first time, they enter a dangerous cycle of escalation. The initial crime rarely satisfies the fantasy completely, leaving the killer with an intense need to improve, refine, or expand the ritual during the next attack. This escalation becomes a defining feature of their signature. It grows in complexity as the killer attempts to bridge the gap between imagination and reality. Investigators often examine early crimes closely because the signature appears in its rawest form, unpolished but emotionally potent. As the crimes continue, The ritual becomes more confident, more deliberate, and sometimes more theatrical. The killer may introduce symbolic gestures or new elements that hold meaning only to them. They might spend more time staging the scene, selecting objects, or manipulating details to create a message they believe investigators or the world will eventually understand. Escalation also reflects the killer's psychological transformation. The fantasy expands as their confidence increases. They begin feeling invincible, driven by a growing need for emotional satisfaction. Some killers even experiment, pushing boundaries to chase a deeper thrill. Others return to familiar patterns, but perform them with greater precision. This intensification is crucial for investigators. It reveals the killer's comfort level, emotional development, and future intentions. A rapidly escalating signature signals a killer who is becoming bolder, more desperate, and more dangerous. Profiler teams often predict that as the ritual grows, so will the frequency and brutality of the crimes. Every small change in the signature, from positioning of objects to the order of actions, adds another piece to the psychological puzzle. And as the ritual evolves, it not only exposes the killer's deepest desires, but also becomes the thread that eventually unravels their entire operation. Crime scenes often reveal more than just physical violence. They expose symbolic choices that reflect the emotional and psychological language of the killer. While investigators search for fingerprints, fibers, and DNA, behavioral experts search for symbols, deliberate placements, repeated objects, and unusual actions that express meaning known only to the killer. These symbols are rarely random. They are carefully chosen representations of past trauma, fantasies, obsessions, or personal beliefs. Some killers arrange scenes to recreate a childhood memory, using objects that appear insignificant to outsiders but hold deep emotional weight for them. Others use symbols to control the narrative, leaving behind items that convey dominance or superiority. Still others craft cryptic displays, arrange shapes, color patterns, or specific numbers that act like coded messages. Even the positioning of a victim can be symbolic, reflecting a ritual the killer believes gives them power. Symbolism allows investigators to identify the killer's emotional triggers. A recurring object may indicate nostalgia or longing. A repeated number might hint at a personal date or memory. The use of religious icons or cultural symbols may reveal ideological motivations. However, symbol interpretation is dangerous without context. Investigators must balance psychological insight with grounded evidence. Not every unusual object signifies meaning. Sometimes, symbolism is the final layer added only after the practical aspects of the crime are complete. But when symbols appear consistently, they become the clearest expression of the killer's psychology. They expose beliefs, fears, fantasies, and emotional scars. They reveal the killer's need to communicate, whether to the police, the public, or themselves. And as investigators decipher these symbols, they begin to read the killer's silent language, unraveling the narrative that the killer believed would remain forever hidden beneath the surface. To investigators, a crime scene is a conversation. Every spilled object, every mark, every absence of something expected tells a story. But when they encounter a potential signature, the entire investigative mindset changes. Detectives shift from gathering physical evidence to analyzing emotional intent, stepping into the killer's psychological space. The first challenge is determining whether a detail is truly meaningful. Crime scenes are chaotic, and coincidences abound. Investigators must distinguish accidental patterns from deliberate ones. This requires collaboration between forensic teams, behavioral analysts, and experienced detectives who understand the subtle language of compulsions. Once a potential signature is identified, investigators look for consistency across multiple scenes. They create detailed profiles, mapping out emotional motives rather than physical MO traits. This involves studying victimology, staging, object placement, and sequencing of events. Every detail becomes part of a psychological mosaic that slowly reveals the killer's inner structure. Detectives also face the emotional toll of confronting patterns created by someone who views murder as a form of expression. They must walk a fine line between respecting evidence and understanding the twisted satisfaction the killer gained. This work requires immense patience and mental resilience. When investigators decode the signature, the case takes a breakthrough turn. They can anticipate the killer's next move, identify likely victims, and predict future escalation. They may even detect signs of stress or fear within variations of the ritual. The signature becomes a roadmap not only to who the killer is, but where they are going. For investigators, the most chilling moment is realizing that the killer wants them to see the pattern. The signature is an invitation, a game the killer believes only they can win. But in that invitation lies their greatest vulnerability. Avoid real-world harm. Investigators often share fictionalized composites of cases to teach how signatures reveal psychological truths. One such case involved a killer who traveled between small towns, selecting isolated victims with no clear connection. At first, police saw nothing linking the crimes. Different locations, different victim types, different methods. But one detail recurred. Each victim's shoes were placed neatly beside their body, toes pointing outward. This gesture had no practical purpose. It didn't help the killer escape. It didn't hide evidence. It was emotional. Behavioral analysts believed the arrangement reflected a memory, perhaps a moment the killer witnessed in childhood, something tied to vulnerability or loss. Once this pattern was recognized, investigators connected the dots. The crimes were no longer isolated events. They were expressions of a single psychological wound. Another composite case featured a killer who left behind drawings, simple geometric shapes drawn with charcoal. At first, detectives suspected gang activity or symbolism tied to religion, but profilers soon realized the shapes reflected a compulsion to impose order in moments of inner chaos. That realization led investigators to focus on individuals with obsessive tendencies and strict routines, ultimately narrowing the suspect pool. In another example, the killer posed each victim facing east. When analysts explored the symbolism, they discovered the killer associated the direction with rebirth and personal transformation. This insight allowed investigators to predict the next crime location by mapping areas significant to the killer's past. These fictionalized case studies show how signatures act as a killer's autobiography written in symbols instead of words. They reveal fears, desires, past trauma, and emerging obsessions. And more importantly, they demonstrate how investigators use these signatures to illuminate paths that the killer believed were hidden forever. Some serial killers feel an overwhelming need not just to kill, but to be noticed. These individuals move beyond physical signatures and begin communicating directly with investigators or the public. Their messages may appear in the form of letters, symbols, drawings, stage scenes, or even riddles. The moment a killer decides to communicate, the investigation shifts into a battle of wits. These killers often view themselves as superior, believing only they can understand the meaning behind their cryptic messages. They crave recognition, attention, or validation. Some leave clues to taunt police, while others craft puzzles they expect investigators to solve. This communication becomes an extension of the signature, another ritual that satisfies their emotional hunger. However, communication is also a trap. Every symbol, every letter, every line of text carries linguistic patterns, personality traits, emotional cues, and behavioral tells. Investigators analyze handwriting, vocabulary, spelling inconsistencies, and psychological themes. These details often reveal far more about the killer than they intended to disclose. Communication can escalate the killer's behavior, pushing them into a dangerous cycle of attention-seeking. They may grow reckless, believing they are untouchable. Some escalate their crimes to maintain public interest, while others become obsessed with the investigators themselves, attempting to form a twisted relationship. But investigators use this communication wisely. They sometimes respond indirectly, through public statements or strategic silence, to manipulate the killer's behavior. The goal is not to provoke them, but to understand them more deeply and predict their next move. When killers communicate, their words become fingerprints of the mind. They expose vulnerabilities, ego, insecurity, and fantasies. And more often than not, the messages they believe will cement their legacy ultimately lead to their downfall, revealing the person behind the monster. The very ritual that gives a serial killer emotional satisfaction is the same ritual that eventually exposes them. Signatures act like a spotlight, illuminating the killer's identity piece by piece. While MO can be copied, changed, or abandoned, a signature cannot be concealed without disrupting the killer's psychological cycle. And because the signature is tied to deep emotional compulsions, they repeat it, even when they know it will draw attention. Investigators exploit this weakness. They study patterns across multiple crime scenes, looking for consistent elements that reveal personality traits, emotional needs, or psychological disorders. Over time, the signature becomes a behavioral fingerprint. It uncovers details about the killer's age, background, beliefs, habits, and stressors. A killer who arranges objects with care may indicate meticulousness or obsessive tendencies. One who leaves chaotic symbolic displays may reveal impulsivity or delusion. Patterns in victim choice may reveal personal grievances or fantasies rooted in past trauma. As pressure mounts from media attention, increased police presence, or personal life stress, the killer's ritual can intensify, becoming sloppier or more emotional. These changes expose vulnerability. Investigators often identify moments when the killer made a mistake, not because they rushed their MO, but because they prioritized their signature over self-preservation. In many cases, the signature is what brings investigators directly to the killer's door. It may match an earlier incident, lead to a relevant psychological profile, or connect crimes that were once considered unrelated. Ultimately, signatures trap killers because they reveal more than they conceal. They expose the truth the killer cannot hide. Their inner world laid bare across every crime scene. And once investigators understand that world, escape becomes impossible. Those signatures are often stable. There are rare and significant moments when they shift, weaken, or disappear. These changes are never random. They reflect emotional turmoil, personal crisis, or fear of capture. When investigators notice a disruption in the ritual, they know something dramatic has happened in the killer's life. A signature may vanish after a close call with authorities when fear temporarily suppresses the compulsion. In these cases, the killer may focus solely on survival, abandoning the ritual in an attempt to appear unpredictable. But this suppression rarely lasts. The emotional need behind the signature eventually resurfaces, often in an even more intense form. In other cases, a signature evolves because the killer themselves undergoes psychological change. New stressors, escalated fantasies, or increased confidence may alter the ritual. Investigators interpret these shifts as signs of emotional instability, internal conflict, or a shift in the killer's fantasy world. The most dangerous moment occurs when a signature becomes erratic. This instability may indicate a killer spiraling out of control, acting impulsively, or breaking from their previous patterns. Such killers become unpredictable, increasing the urgency of the investigation. Sometimes, a signature changes because the killer wants to send a new message, either to investigators or to someone from their past. These signature changes often point towards significant emotional triggers, allowing detectives to narrow down suspects or identify psychological turning points. Regardless of the reason, any disruption in the signature becomes a major breakthrough. It signals vulnerability, leaving investigators clues about what the killer fears, what they crave, and what pressures they are facing. A changing signature is a crack in the mask. And through that crack, investigators often find the truth. In the end, every investigation into a serial killer's signature becomes a journey into the darkest corners of human psychology. Long after the physical evidence is bagged, the fingerprints collected, and the crime scenes cleared, the patterns remain etched into the memories of investigators who had to decipher a mind that speaks in ritual instead of words. A signature is more than a mark left at a scene. It is the killer's identity unmasked, a reflection of their deepest wounds, obsessions, and desires. It is the emotional echo they cannot silence, no matter how careful they try to be. And as each thread of that pattern is pulled apart, the truth of who they are slowly unravels. Investigators know that no matter how clever, how elusive, or how cold the killer may seem, the signature will always betray them. It is the one part of the crime they cannot abandon, the one part of themselves they cannot hide. It becomes their downfall, the silent confession left behind again and again. The ritual that once gave them power ultimately turns into the chain that binds them. When the case finally closes and the killer is unmasked, the pattern remains as a haunting reminder of the emotional storm that drove them. For the investigators, it is proof that even in the most twisted acts, there is always a path to the truth written not in words, but in symbols, behaviors, and rituals that expose the human behind the horror. And as we step away from this world of deadly patterns, one truth lingers. Signatures may be born in darkness, but once revealed, they shine a light that can never be ignored.